All right, well, on that note of laughter, let's go ahead and get started. Just by way of welcome, my name is Catherine. I'm here on behalf of the Center for Ideas and Society, the host for this event. We're so excited to be here with you today as part of our Hot Off the Presses series. I mean that sincerely. It's always exciting to me personally to celebrate new publications and to learn more about them. So thank you for being here. And just to note, you will have seen a notice, I'm sure, from Zoom. They're ever helpful with their notices to let you know that we are recording this event. We're doing so to be able to share it with folks whose living arrangements and living/work arrangements do not allow them to be with us in a synchronous way. So they'll be able to watch this later at their convenience. So here at the beginning, we just want to welcome you and to acknowledge we have a land acknowledgement that we give. The land in and around UC Riverside in Southern California has been tended for generations by the Cahuilla, the Tongva, the Serrano, the Luiseno peoples, and it's our honor and our obligation to acknowledge that caretaking and tending and to join with their descendants in celebrating and honoring that care, to co-labor alongside them in the present, and to carry that obligation forward into the future. And so we share that with you today, and we thank you for being here and for sharing in that obligation. So on that note of gratitude, I will hand this over to Dr. Warnke, Georgia Warnke, the director of the center, to give us the introductions and get the ball rolling for us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's session. First, I'll introduce Toby Miller, who you all know. Toby Miller was a professor at UCR for a decade and then at NYU for 11 years. He is now Stuart Hall Professor of Cultural Studies at, and I always muck this up, Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, whatever. And Sir Walter Murdoch, Distinguished Collaborator at Murdoch University. It would be worse if I tried to speak Spanish. It would be like somebody running their fingernails over a chalkboard. Remember that? He is the author and editor of over 50 books that have been translated into Spanish, Chinese, Portuguese, Japanese, Turkish, German, Italian, Farsi, French, Urdu, and Swedish. His most recent volumes are Violence, 2021, The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture, 2020, How Green is Your Smartphone, which we had a book session on in the fall, and a number of other books. He is past president of the Cultural Studies Association in the United States. We also have with us Anamaria Tamayo-Duque, who is assistant professor in the arts department at the Universidad de Antioquia. She has a BA in anthropology and a PhD in critical dance studies from UCR. Her research areas are popular dance, performances of national identity, body and media, embodiment of gender, race in Latin America, as well as the role of the moving body in constructions of political citizenship in Colombia. Her current research looks at artistic practice as a medium for political citizenship in Colombia. And she has a grant called Embodied Performance Practices and Processes of Reconciliation, Construction of Memory and Peace in Choco and Media Pacifico, Colombia. And finally, we have with us Olga Lucia Sorzano, who's a researcher at Embodied Performances, Memory and Reconciliation in Colombia, and Circus's International Encounter. With a background in economics and foreign policy, her work lies at the crossroads of cultural and decolonial studies. Her doctoral research analyses and analyzes circus in Britain and Colombia to inquire for global interconnections in the stratification of artistic practices, peoples, and systems of knowledge. So there's a lot of knowledge here, and I'm going to turn it over to Toby to lead us through it.
Well, thanks, Georgia. You should hear me speak political theory. I think I do it okay, but my audience seems minimal. So it's very kind of you and Catherine to host us, and also to acknowledge the historical and ongoing tendering, as it were, of the land. special thanks to people I know who are here. I mentioned Mariam and Mimi, but also Gina. And want to acknowledge that I was lucky to work with Anamaria and with Olga Lucia, Anamaria at UCR and then in London, and Olga at City University of London. And they were two of the several Colombians who collaborated with me in this book. So it's called The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture. And I'm just going to speak for another 4 minutes about it. So this is the greatest hits and latest memories version, whereas Professors Tamayo-Duque and Sorzano will have things of greater profundity to offer. Basically, what I was trying to do here, based on having traveled, worked, and lived for a few months over an 8-year period in Colombia, was to try to understand what part the popular seems to play in this lengthy and complex history of violence. And perhaps in discussion, we can talk more about causes. So what does the book do? Well, it's got a long introductory chapter where I summarize political, economic, historical, religious, cultural, and intellectual reasons that may be relevant, in particular the work of some of the violentólogos, which I guess we would call violentologists, right? Who, in a succession of governmental commissions dating back to the year that Michael Jackson, Prince, Madonna, and I were all born, have endeavored to use to divine explanations for the horrendous conflicts that have gone on, along with the work of, in a sense, creative figures like Gabriel García Márquez and his journalistic, ethnographic, novelistic accounts for this. So after that lengthy introduction, the first chapter, which is with Alfredo Sabag Fajardo, who's a noted media figure and professor in Barranquilla on the Caribbean coast of the country, looks at violence, the narco culture, and football, because as you probably know, many of the major football teams in Colombia were historically places for bling on the part of the leading narcos, to show their power, to show their money, to show their influence. And also, of course, nowadays, when bling is not so popular amongst the successors to those famous narcos, to clean money. Money laundering even occurs at the university level in Colombia. Then the next chapter, which is a joint one with Olga Lucia and Anamaria, is about two different aspects of tourism. One is looking at the history of tourism as an economic endeavor in Colombia and how it relates to discourses of creative industries, but in particular, how it often leads to sexually exploitative tourism on the part principally of light-skinned men coming to the country in order to have sex with underage, mostly female children, and how that has arisen, how it has thrived, and what steps have been taken to try to counter it. And the second part is specifically to do with an attempt to increase British tourism during a period when Avianca, the national airline, started direct flights from London to Bogota, maybe 5 days a week at that time, I think, right? And this was to create a plaque that would commemorate what was actually an appalling siege of Cartagena de Indias, which is also the place where much of the sex tourism goes on, by the British hundreds of years ago, not to commemorate, not to mark the resistance to this attempt to starve hundreds of thousands to death, but rather supposedly to celebrate the British being there. This led to the invitation of someone trading as Prince Charles and his consort to come to Cartagena de Indias to unveil a plaque, but there was massive resistance from left, right, and center, and the plaque was actually shattered. So we look at that story. The next chapter, which is about media issues, is with Marta Milena Barrios and Jesus Arroyave, and this again has, in a sense, two sides to it. One side is about Colombian journalists and a systematic campaign to intimidate, injure, and murder Colombian journalists. This particularly applies, I think it's fair to say, to women and also to people in small towns where there might be one media outlet that comes out once a week, but where that media outlet is a potential challenge to narco domination. And then the second side of the chapter is about the narco novelas, not the ones that outsiders might be familiar with on Netflix or whatever, like Narcos, but those that are big hits on primetime broadcast television and the way in which they carry with them a massive amount of stereotyping, of violence, of gender, in particular of femininity, and glorify, glamorize, going back to Bling, the notion of success becoming available to people by operating the life of a vivo and not a tonto. In other words, someone who can buck the system versus someone who goes along with it. And then the last chapter, which is also with Marta Milena Barrios, is a content analysis, which was also essayed in the work on narco novelas, of correspondence in the major newspapers about the Rio Magdalena, which is the big river, which is the principal waterway, apart from the Amazon, really, in South America and certainly in Colombia, which has been tragically almost brought to the point of complete contamination as a consequence of everything from untrammeled industrial development, bombing and throwing of bodies into it by the guerrilla and the paramilitares, and a general lack of concern for the river. What's interesting about these letters, which go back to the 60s, is the way in which they instantiate a sense of passion for the Magdalena and a sense of loss and trauma over its degradation. So then there's a conclusion. As I guess you can see, there is a lot that is very sad in this book. There is a lot that is about the horror that is part of daily life. It's almost impossible to meet anybody in Colombia in my years spent there who hasn't lost a family member to kidnapping or assassination or something very close. And that horror is real and it's ongoing. There have been more indigenous defenders of land in Colombia murdered in the last 5 years than there have been British and Australian soldiers killed in the US imperial wars in Afghanistan and Iraq put together. But there is also lots of hope. There is a flourishing academic culture, a flourishing culture of the kind that Olga Lucia and Anamaria know about in areas like dance and circus. There is a flourishing literature. And to finish up, for those of you who remember the great essay by Roland Barthes, J'aime, je n'aime pas, I like, I don't like, where he has this fabulous little binary of things in ordinary life that he appreciates versus those that he abjures. Garbo, what Colombians and other South Americans call García Márquez, has a similar list about what he sees as the duality of Colombian life, where there is immense generosity and caring and feeling at the same time as there is this horror. So thanks for that slightly lengthier introduction than I had meant. And I wonder if I could pass on to my colleagues now with thanks.
Shall we choose? Okay, I'll take the word then. Okay, well, thank you very much for this invitation. And also thanks to Toby for inviting me to contribute in the research and the chapter. For me, it was a really interesting task or challenge. With my previous experience as a policymaker that Anne McLean, who is here with us, can certify. And then combine that experience with our analysis and of cultural studies, decolonial studies, and all this policy making in Colombia. So the book made use of a common metaphor used to describe Colombia in terms of a dualism of good and bad people, or warm, lovely, and violent creatures, to highlight the presence of violence and the multiple forms in which this violence is also contested and counteracted by social movements, civil societies, and activism. So this book makes these two parallels, and in each chapter we can see these ways of perpetuate violence, but also movements that are really fighting against them. So this book highlights an internalized violence in Colombia that is perceived in everyday life, with figures like 39% of children attacked committed at home, and also most of the crimes against women who are committed by lovers, but also in the policy making and more precisely popular culture. So this book takes examples like football, tourism, and other expressions to show how the making of popular culture replicates and promotes violence. In the case of tourism, that is the chapter that I contribute to, one of the main violent behaviors that we identify here is the fact that policy making is directed to attract and to satisfy foreigners and their needs and desires, especially those of US male citizens and Western Europeans, rather than attending the needs, realities, and desires of the local population. So Colombia, the people and landscapes are portrayed as resources, as fruits to be squeezed, like the orange in our fashionable orange economy, as a task force that is ready to serve foreign needs rather than the locals. So tourist campaigns invite foreigners, foreign investment, and also visitors to take advantage of Colombia's beauty and products. One of the most successful is women, alongside coffee beans, emerald beaches, sand. And this happens in a country where the basic needs of the population are totally unfulfilled, especially those of women, where it's famine, lack of employment, where the macho culture dominates, and where women are mainly part of the informal economy. So these policies invite foreigners to take advantage of these products in face of a lack of needs of vulnerable people, especially women and young people. So here is one of the other contributions of the book, and is to show or to highlight the disconnection between some of the local policies. I'm not going to say that every local policy here is disconnected, but some of them are, like Economía Naranja, the orange economy, and tourism, with the local realities and needs of the population. Finally, the book also offers a global and an international context to show how Colombia is not an isolated case of violent and crazy people, but is another player in this capitalist and extractive economy that is led by the main economic and political powers. So this is also important, and the book plays a lot, bringing examples from other countries to highlight how Colombia is just another part in the puzzle. We can probably go further in these topics and talk a little bit more about the social movements, activism, and the creative economy, which is one of the main policies nowadays, where tourism is included in the case of Colombia. I don't know if Anamaria wants to say something else.
Tu micrófono no está funcionando.
Thank you, Olga. Ever since November of last year, there's been a social movement calling for declaring humanitarian emergency in Colombia about the feminicidios, the killing of women based on their gender identity. And I was reading yesterday an article about it, and it said something that resounded with this book very, in a strong fashion. They said that because of the militarization of everyday life, this emergency was so grave. It's redundant to say it as such, but it's because we have people trained in arms and with easy access to guns in the everyday context that very frequently actions of violence can turn deadly and lethal to women. And I was thinking about that connected to popular culture because as Toby was saying in his introduction, I think that usually we are, we have read a lot of books about Colombia and Colombian violence from the point of view of the hard issues, right? The armed conflict or the peace process or conflicts around land or around social leaders. But when we approach these topics from the popular culture point of view, it's striking to see precisely how all these issues, I don't know if it translates or trickle, or I don't know, they move toward these spheres of popular culture that you would think that is something that is blinded by that, but no, it's very present. So what I think is that looking at these everyday issues is very interesting to notice the way in which everyday behaviors are built. And I'm going to make an example, is precisely how this violence in the relationship of everyday people can be seen, and you can witness the way in which this 50-year armed conflict violence has infused the everyday life. So in the part Toby and I wrote about, in the chapter, in the part that we wrote about the plague, the case of the plague, and as Olga was telling us about the tourism, this is very interesting because they want British tourism to come, and that is why they want to put a plaque honoring the British. When a few blocks away from the plague, there was this Blas de Lezo, the Spanish conquistador statue, very important center of Cartagena identity. So what I found very interesting in this conflict, and it was very visible in social media at the time in Colombia, was that there was this dispute over the identity, the Colombian identity, but that Colombian identity was based on different ways of violently taking the land and violently conquering the land, right? One was the British side and the other was the Spanish side. So when we were doing the research for the social media narratives regarding the plague, what we found that was compelling was how hurt the people in Colombia was, because the British were being celebrated, and that's true. Like a little bit away, they wanted to put a cross honoring the dead sailors, but the people fighting this, they were fighting it because the Spanish conquistadors were not being celebrated enough. So that was very interesting and striking to realize that fact. And in fact, these two kinds of violence being celebrated and the logic behind that, right? So that's why I was saying that sometimes in this book, talking about issues of telenovelas, for example, or football, as Olga was saying, it's striking to find these spaces of, I wouldn't say normalization of violence, but it's just it's so well intertwined in the everyday fabric of life that you barely see it sometimes, right? So yes, there was these logics of tourism and these logics of bringing British capital to Cartagena, but behind that, and especially the response from all the Colombian people through the Twitter platform especially, was very interesting. The debates around precisely these ideas of what is to be Colombian. And as Olga was saying, this is a very interesting decolonial narrative of what means to be Colombian in this moment and place, and how many violence are we accounted for in the constitution of our Colombian identity, right? And whose voice is being celebrated in these platforms. So I felt very honored to participate in this book precisely because it brings a novel approach to looking at everyday issues from a different lens, let's say. I would leave it at that, and we can maybe talk a little bit more in the questions.
Toby, are you interested in more exposition analysis, or should we open it up for questions?
I love to talk, but I prefer to listen.
Okay, so we are ready for questions. If you want to just raise your hand, I think I can see you. Rui, put on your microphone.
Yes, I just had a question. Maybe I missed it. I'm sorry I was a bit late. There was another meeting. But I would be, thank you, Anamaria, and Toby and Olga for your wonderful, insights into, perpetuation of violence. And violence is an everyday reality, which is so deeply ingrained that you hardly notice it. But my question was about, narcos and the televisation of violence. And it's almost celebratory circulation across the world as, highly successful series that everyone's watching, everyone is talking. There are movie stars in India who are hooked to it, who take their, cue from how to design their shows from it. It's even inspired a series of films, right from Sacred Games to Thunder, which has just been released day before yesterday on Amazon Prime, that are, regurgitating that format and that formulae. How is that, where do you think real life is recreating that violence, and where is real life in a way owes its violence to these imaginaries of violence? It's a very complex scenario, but it's important because it is affecting the way world is seeing the connection between violence and popular culture.
Easy questions first, huh? Ruhi, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for coming along.
Good to see you.
Let me have a quick go at this and then pass over to my colleagues, if I may. One of the illustrations that's in the book is of a promotional poster for Narcos on British rush hour rail, where it's saying, relax and enjoy yourself on your daily commute. And then there's a picture of Pablo Escobar. In Madrid, the way in which Netflix promoted these first seasons of Narcos, which were about Colombia, now it's about Mexico. It follows me, inevitably now that I'm there. No, just kidding. And it had one of the, major statues of the conquistadores in Madrid celebrating his achievements with a huge banner promoting Narcos, saying, essentially, I'm looking forward to a white Christmas. White Christmas being, of course, a reference to cocaine. So there is an appalling stereotyping that Netflix in the United States and elsewhere relies on in the association of the country with killing, the guerrilla in particular, coffee, football, but most of all cocaine. And that appalling association that is made again and again, constantly in the British and US media. You can see it on everything from late night television on the broadcast networks in the US to tabloid newspapers in the UK. Anamaria and Olga, from your years living in Britain, you'd have experienced this when you met British people, without a doubt, that you had to deal with this immediate stereotyping. So there is an element of that that is completely irresponsible, in particular because it fails to acknowledge the fact that, of course, the major stimulus to the cocaine trade and the way that it shifted from other parts of South America to Colombia and now is shifting to Mexico is needy, nerdy nostrils in Western Europe and the United States, a kind of supply and demand effect, plus the fact that the United States in its Plan Colombia that has militarized so much of Colombian life has been about trying to destroy and kill rather than deal with these things, plus the fact that the criminalization of cocaine in these major consumer markets has generated horrendous need and use, and of course, stimulated illegal activity in Colombia itself. There are many other sources for this problem, but there's a complicity that is very multinational and very important. Then there's a second issue, which is that And this book that Georgia kindly mentioned that has just come out called Violence, that I've written, which is a more general survey, which is that so much of the popular is orchestrated around violence. Now that can, if you take an Aristotelian perspective, here comes my political theory accent, Georgia, be deemed to be cathartic and a way of expressing in aesthetic terms what therefore doesn't have to be expressed in physical ones. Or you can see it as a stimulus to more violence, a glamorization. Just to finish off, Russia Today, which has a dubious reputation in the United States, but is pretty good on everything except Russian and US domestic politics and Central European politics, sent a journalist, a British journalist, to Medellin, which is where Anamaria is from, actually, and where Olga Lucia is living at present, was nearby, to cover the life of a notorious sicario or assassin for Escobar, known as Popeye like Popeye. And as it followed him around Medellin for an hour of television, you saw not only very moving interviews with victims of his violence. He was probably individually responsible for 350 murders, in addition to being involved in blowing up other people, maiming other people, went to jail for 2 decades for one killing, got out. Not only does he try to make peace in a bizarre, macho and evangelical way with a number of his victims, but he is almost mobbed on the street by the popular classes as he walks around. So mythic is his status as a vivo, as someone who lives life to the fullest, who is not constrained by bourgeois norms, if you like. So, sorry for the long answer, but I just wanted to emphasize that this has long roots in culture more generally. Dealing with violence is part of drama, it's part of struggle, it's part of poetry, it's part of fiction. But B, that a lot of this has to do with the nature of the cocaine trade and its internationalization, with the United States and Western Europe massively responsible, and C, that there is a charismatic element to these appalling people, which doesn't speak to me, but speaks to many.
Yes, just to complement Toby's view, before Narcos, there were many soap operas and movies being produced in Colombia about the topic. I remember growing up during the 80s in Medellin, and because precisely of this idealized Robin Hood-esque view of the marijuana traffic at the beginning of the 70s. These were like huge, heroic, crazy endeavors, trafficking legal marijuana. Pablo Escobar became this Robin Hood character in Medellin, helping the poor, helping build neighborhoods or helping people around him. That became a very powerful figure because this was in conjunction with his idea of his public persona. He wanted to be, as he was indeed a senator. He participated in politics. He was a council member here in Medellin. So he was very, very popular in one time. And I think that media narratives didn't completely work to destroy that myth and didn't give enough voice to the victims of the war against drugs in the time the Escobar bombing and the war against Escobar. So that became a myth that was created and developed during the moment of the soap operas at the beginning of the 2000s, when we have Dolls of the Mafia, or Without Boobs, There's No Paradise. I don't know the translation, the official translation for the title of the soap opera, or the Sicario's Virgin, certain other soap operas and movies about the Sicario phenomenon going on, especially in Medellin and Cali. It was interesting because there was another miniseries produced actually by one of the nearby producers, Teleset, I think it is, the one who produced or did a partial production of Narcos. They did a production of a mini-series called Pablo Escobar, trying to give more voice to the victims of Pablo Escobar rather than to his narrative, but it wasn't as successful. So we had that, and also the movies. But what we also have to understand that these Narcos are also, I don't know, I feel it in the same way as the mafia movies of the New York era, right? The 80s mafia movies. So, or the Italian mafia movies. That's, I think that we are a little bit concerned of moral panics because this is so hugely like a globalized phenomenon that we didn't experience with those movies, right? That my main concern is especially because we can see that this idea of the narco who's successful, who's a daredevil, who it's still being very much a big part of the ideology for popular classes in many parts of Latin America, right? But not only in Latin America. It's being globalized, and I think that's your question, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's a question of also of masculinity too, right? That is very interesting here. The gender roles here in these ways of relationship with money and with luxury, and so it's intersecting ideas of class, of gender, but it's also globalizing a narrative that that I think we feel it bigger, but it's not new. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear.
I agree with you. It's not new, but somehow its resonance is very new. You know, the way it resonates is something completely new, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I just wanted to say that those of you who don't want to be recorded, you can put questions in the chat and I will read them out. Other questions? Wendy?
I think Olga might have something to add to that.
Oh, right.
We can continue with the next one, but I just wanted to say that the big issue here is the commodification of violence and of Pablo Escobar and heroification of these kind of figures that just perpetuate ideas, like Toby said, of the vivo and el bobo. So it's to make this kind of culture of Pablo Escobar like the hero and the way of being. There are young people here that never leave Pablo Escobar and they think that he's a hero. So in that way, it perpetuates and make this culture like forever rather than a period of time in Colombia.
So we have a question from Wendy and then a question from Wolfgang. Wendy, do you want to go first? You have to unmute.
Hi, Toby, good to see you. I'm sorry I am late also because Ruhi and I were at a department meeting just 10 minutes ago, so we were all late. So I missed the major part of your talk. So forgive me for if I do not know much about your main content of the book, but I just I'm very curious. You see the violence actually prevailing in all popular culture, including the Colombia popular culture and also Hollywood popular culture. So I'm wondering, do you see any connection between this Colombia popular culture, the representation of violence, and Hollywood movies representation of violence? Any historical root for this prevailing of violence in our popular culture? And do you see any impact of Hollywood movies on Colombia's popular culture in terms of violence and masculinity?
Wendy, lovely to see you, and also great to see a fantastic image of UC Riverside and the Shale Mountain behind you. Also great to see Steve and his, maybe it's Santa Cruz, Steve, is it? Back to undergrad days?
No, northeast of Brazil.
Oh, apologies to all concerned. I thought Brazil wasn't allowed into the United States, but visually maybe. So in this ode to Bolsonaro and others. So Wendy, you're absolutely right. And when Anamaria was talking about 80s gangster movies, which are very influential in their depictions for lots of people. I was thinking of back to the 30s because I'm more ancient than anybody else gathered here, and to Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers was the small niche studio amongst the majors in Hollywood. It needed to find a different kind of textuality and audience, and it settled on the immigrant white working class. And therefore its representation of gangsterism and of its criminalization was in some ways sympathetic and very powerful. Bob Sklar, my late former colleague at NYU, wrote a fantastic book called City Boys about in the early 90s, about some of the ways in which the lives of these children of immigrants who became Hollywood stars reflected or indexed the very characters they played on screen as Jewish wrestlers or Italian boxers or gangsters. And so there's a long history of this, and there's a long history, to invoke the concept Anamaria mentioned, of moral panics about it. You can go back a century to when they were just moving from the Lower East Side to Southern California, and to read about anxieties to do with violence and its effect on what were deemed to be vulnerable publics. It was thought that racist ideas, violent ideas, and sexual desire as being something legitimate outside marriage were all being successfully stimulated by Hollywood amongst working class young men in particular. And in fact, that produced the pain fund studies of the early 30s, which birthed symbolic interactionism, one of the principal qualitative methods of sociology from that point on. So it's certainly, Wendy, an ongoing issue. And we see all kinds of anxieties still today about not only Hollywood in its classic filmic sense, but of course a whole succession of genres and technologies associated with the young, where the young are deemed on the one hand to be early adopters, pioneers, super competent at understanding technologies, but also as being victims of them and victims of the genres associated with them. And you see that really from the beginnings of the top 40 in 1950s radio, all the way through to electronic games and of course debates today about so-called social media. So it's an ongoing theme. It's certainly an issue. It is not unique to the United States, but because so many genres were readapted, readopted, refashioned in the United States and effectively peddled initially by Hollywood and then by other electronic media, that there is this association. But the evidence in terms of really now 90 years of attempts to draw very clear causality as well as correlation between exposure to violence in the media and enacting things in a violent way is problematic, other than when it comes to people already predisposed to violence in other parts of their lives. But the research goes on and on and on.
Thanks.
Any other answers, or should we turn to Wolfgang Formann? Wolfgang?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Looking forward to reading your book. Thank you for the contribution. Just some observations about Narcos. I found it quite interesting. I made a interview with young students together with Enrique Uribe Youngblood. You know him. And we found out that for young ones, Narcos is kind of a reference. It's a history book. So they can evaluate it like, well, this is about drugs. But when it comes to the 80s and 90s, they say, well, I've learned a lot about my country. I mean, that was fascinating for me because how can it be? And there are some regional differences. So students from Bogota think very different about Narcos than students from Medellin, for example. And I'm asking, well, I'm asking myself, well, there is no public television, and maybe there is a lack of kind of public history classes. And I was shocked to learn that in Colombia, students in school don't have history class. In the 90s, I think until recently, there is no history class. So whatever you learn from private television. And a second observation, I came across this film Alma de Héroe, de Orlando Prado, which was one of the most successful films in Colombia and won a premiere at the Macondo Film Festival. And it's an extremely violent film. It's a very nasty, bad film. And I think I'm always surprised as a German with my history, now living in Colombia. I think, how can it be that violence is so rooted in the society? I mean, this is just more an observation, but it's really interesting to see how these, on another level, not about narcos, but now about the military, about the machismo and slaughtering of people, becomes entertainment. And this is quite of, well, for me, it's quite of shocking. And well, maybe you can comment on this. Thanks.
I would like to say something. When I grew up, television was romance, soap operas, romantic, and there were a lot of regional soap operas like Café and all these legendary TV series that were great, like Betty la Fea, Betty the Ugly, and Saint-Tropez, and there were many. So there is a long list of TV that wasn't violent in that way. We grew up with Don Chinche, I don't know, a lot of comedies of the 80s and 90s that wasn't violent necessarily. Then after all this violent period of the 80s and Pablo Escobar and this became big figure, Colombia became renowned for the drugs and violence itself. And now that's what it sells about Colombia. And now, if you open The Guardian, the only news that you read about Colombia is about violence and this kind of drug imaginary. I'm not going to say that there's no violence here, no. But in a way, and going back to my point, the commodification of violence, of narcos and drugs, as part of the popular culture and as part of portraying Colombia abroad, is becoming like a idealization also of Colombia, right? So this is just to say that we have to also identify that point in which this gave a turn and we became the drugs and the narcos country. It wasn't like that before, and that's something quite tricky or something interesting to think about, how these international and local ideas of the country play a role, and also the role of commodification and becoming just Colombia about narcos. So everything is narcos, everything is violence in terms of popular culture and television.
Expanding on Olga's ideas, the soap operas Olga is talking about are very beautiful, because for me it's also, I have this memory of infancy, very idealized, of watching these soap operas talking about the regional differences with a touch of magical reality. So it was all about being the Macondo country, you know what I mean? So these soap operas were about the differences between regions. So there was, as Olga mentioned, Saint-Tropez, who talked about the Atlantic coast traditions, and there was these mysterious ideas, or there was this other soap opera talking about another region, and they were very romantic, but there were also an undercurrent, and recently, actually, I remember being a TA in UCR, I gave a talk about a soap opera very famous in Mexico that very recently I realized that was done way before in Colombia, called Aguas Mansas, and it talked about the period of the La Violencia with capitals from this period of time from the 50s. Where violence was spectacularized. So Maria Victoria Uribe writes about the spectacularization of killings during this period of La Violencia between liberals and conservatism, where they have these very spectacular ways of killing with a machete. So this spectacularization of violence in Colombia comes way long before. And now that Olga and I are participating in this research, talking about performance practices of memory in the Pacific coast, it was very striking because certain indigenous group, when asked about violence, they talk about 500 years of violence. So I think we cannot underestimate the story we're carrying behind. And as you say, yes, the curriculum for secondary studies in Colombia cancel history for many years, combining it with geography and doing a very basic knowledge, a very general knowledge. I wouldn't say that it operated because of the neoliberal politics of the 90s, but I think something has to do with that. But the reality is that we don't have our new generations. We haven't processed our history the way we should have if we had that. But the thing is, and I'm talking from my high school experience, the way history was taught was the Eurocentric history of the conquistador coming to save us. So again, it's very problematic. So I think, and that's why I was saying that for me, the research about social media and all this controversy of the plague was the contesting narratives of the Colombian identity, because it's all about that. We all go back to, well, how do we conceive ourselves? And as Olga mentions, we constantly go back to looking at ourselves through the eyes of other people. So that's why I found it very interesting that when any international figure arrives, the first thing the journalists ask is, what do you think of Colombia? Constantly, that's the first question they ask. This anxiety around what people think about us and how do we see ourselves through the eyes of the people outside, that I think derives from this Eurocentrical education that has not been revised and critically analyzed to understand what's happening. And when you have this empty space, well, Netflix and History Channel enters and fills it, right? But I think I'm not sure, but I feel that's not only in Colombia, where these docu-series are replacing historical narratives in several moments. Not sure, but that's my feeling, that history is being rewritten with these soapy documentaries that at the end are constructing certain narratives that we have no control over it, right?
There is a long debate about the crown in the UK, and they have to put a note saying this is fiction, this is not reality, because they were a bit itchy with the messages it was sending.
So Wolfgang, thanks for your question, and your research with Enrique Uribe Youngblood is fabulous. For those who don't know Enrique's work, it's really great. But to give the capsule story from different theoretical perspectives about the notion of this encrusted violence, you know, political scientists say that it's all to do with absence of government, because the Spanish conquistadores right through to today were never able to gain genuine state suzerainty over large swathes of the country. So that's the political science explanation. The historians tend to divide between a kind of herda position, which is that violence is in the essence of the nation, it's just there as part of Colombianness, versus a Hobsbawmian one, which is that it's about the Marxist struggles for modernity. Psychologist Steven Pinker, whose narrative, of course, is that there is a totalizing pacification of the world that is diminishing violence, he throws his hands in the air, as do other such people when it comes to Colombia, and puts it down to Marxism and alcohol, which is clearly a fatal combination. It certainly destroyed my life. You know, a lot of gender scholars talk about the particular kind of machismo and also marianismo as the set of stereotypes surrounding forms of femininity. Religious scholars talk about the fact that along with Mexico, in Hispanic America, Colombia has been the most Catholic country. It's had the most churches. And a lot of political historians talk about the struggle between conservatives and liberals. Big 19th century struggle that goes, as you know, right through into the middle of the 20th century, which is about Catholics who are very monistic in their view, who make Catholicism constitutionally a compulsory part of education, versus liberals, influenced as in much of Latin America by British and French positivists, who want to see a more secular approach. I mean, Steve, you get this in Brazil. Obviously, you get it in Peru and many other places, but it takes an extraordinarily violent form in Colombia. I mean, a century of civil wars. And then you get the violontólogos, whom we mentioned earlier, who have some Habermasians, who thought that if you increased the public sphere by devolving power to mayoralties, you would diminish violence. Who lined up to take over mayoralties? The narcos and the paramilitares, etc. So there are all these explanations. They've all got certain things going for them other than the idiocy of essentialist social psychology per Steven Pinker. But there is something there. Sorry, the chaos of the world's fifth biggest city, you can probably hear in the background. There is something there that continues to emerge in cultural forms of different kinds, but also emerges in ways that are very pacific, very collaborative, and very much about surviving. And that resistance element, I think, is tremendously important and really is worth bearing in mind alongside the very real horror stories.
Other questions? There's a note from Bella, who had to leave early. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. A friend of mine is an actor in Colombia who struggles with the stories he has to keep telling in order to earn a living. So it seems like you can't tell other stories, more peaceful stories.
Georgia,
You
can I
don't
ask
have
you
the
something?
phenotype. Sorry, Mimi.
Yeah.
I was remembering a story of a friend of mine who's also an actor, and he gets hired to do many Netflix series. And he says, my face is the face of a robber, the face of a narco. So no one is going to hire me to play a lawyer. No one is going to hire me to play anything less because I'm dark skinned, I'm not too tall, right? So there's also this stereotyping of Latin Americans are certain things that also helps with these constraints for the actors. But sorry, Mimi, go ahead.
Hi, Anamaria, I want to comment on what you said, the roots of violence in Colombia and also Colombian identity. If if that leads me to think about the Latin American boom writers, not only García Márquez, you think about Maria Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, the entire generation is in search for the accuracy of what identities we are, not only in Colombia, the entire Latin American discourse. What happens is when you said, the memories, when you revisited the past, right? You think about the Cien Años de Soledad, where which memory gets erased, which memory gets kept, right? And also, and what is it? Un hombre muy viejo de alas enormes, where again, the totally disfigured memories. So it's not that the Colombians themselves have a say. It is the confluence of culture where the predominant element that tells them what we are. So if you think about the conquistadors, the Spanish or an English influence, they still have a significant cultural influence to say what Colombians are. When you think of Colombians, oh, they are all violent, they are drogadistas, that's what we think, right? So although it's 500 years, after 500 years now,
but this cultural roots lingers, you know, so deeply embedded. You cannot, eradicate that. That's why Garcia Márquez, you know, proposed the term realismo mágico, not really magic, not really realism, it's in between, but people are not able to understand that in between us. So I guess that's the concept where violence gets stuck. So I appreciate very much your sense of history to find to identify the roots, but it's also very much embedded in the literature, you know, in the cultural discourse as well. So I'd love to hear your further comments on you think history to literature to the culture imagination.
Yes, Mimi, you're right. And if you think backwards, remembering a little bit of my Garcia Márquez, everyone in Garcia Márquez histories, they are coming from a war or remembering a killing or preparing for a killing, or, you know, violence is very like kept at bay by an inch. All the time we're struggling to live between periods of violence or to live within periods of violence, right? So that's, I really like your comment because once again, I want to mention, right now, Olga and I are working on a research on performance and embodied memories of the Pacific Colombia, and the role, the embodiment and the performance, the role of the body in the construction of memories. And the issue about memory is that this idea of the in-betweenness of memory, but also of history. So I remember talking to Olga last year about certain aspects of how people talk about their experiences of violence. And there's a lot of issues when we were talking about with people from the Pacific coast about disappearances, and the logic behind those disappearances were based on certain fears of the powers of the living body or the rests of the body, right? And that connects with non-Eurocentric ways of understanding time, of understanding relationships, of understanding history, and of understanding energy and ancestry. So I think in the 19th century, Colombia worked really, really hard to become European and to adapt to the logics of progress. But I think the 21st century is telling us unequivocally that that's not the way, that we have to listen to these other ways to understand all these concepts, to understand really what's going on and how people relate to those big concepts of memory, of history, and of Colombian identity. That, for me, that's what's on the center of this conversation.
I think there's also an important point here about developmentalism, not psychological, but industrial. And the fact that Colombia is, as you may know, along with Australia, the most ecologically diverse country in the world. It is also one of the ones blessed, if you don't believe in the Dutch disease, with vast natural resources that are deployed in a very cavalier way. And some of the violence derives not only from the violence of conventional developmentalism, digging everything up, shipping it out, making things a quarry, but from illegal developmentalism, right? There are lots and lots of shady, shadowy customers who are working for mining and other extractive industries in many parts of Colombia, who may or may not be connected to legitimate multinational corporations, who are murdering social defenders, indigenous defenders of the environment, maybe on a daily basis, certainly with complete cavalier abandon. And again, this is one of these instances where things get slotted home to a history of national identity, which is relevant, but is also related to the prevailing political economy and the way in which the distinction between the informal and formal sectors, which is a big issue throughout the global South, but big time in Latin America, as many people from there will know, as it is in South Asia, Ruhi, where that distinction produces extremely messy circumstances, and where traditional oligarchies and oligopolies operate in concert with these shady, shadowy agents and with multinational capital in its criminal and non-criminal aspects. Your mic's off, Georgia.
We have one more question in the chat, which maybe will end us on a more positive note. How can we promote the power of alternative narratives emerging from what most times are just very small social collectives or organizations working from the ground?
This is a great question. So I have some doctoral students working with me in Colombia at Colombian universities. And one of them is working on the way in which, as part of the peace process, however problematic this may be, there's a massive network of local community radio stations in which the idea is to bring together the guerrilla, local indigenous peoples, Afro-Colombians, and the paramilitares to try to work together, to make programming together. I think that is a potentially useful initiative, though problematic in many cases. There has to be a government-funded national network for indigenous television makers. There has to be a national network, or at least a regional one, for Afro-Colombian television makers, so that alternative stories are told. There has to be a focus on the big light-skinned working class in places like Bogota, so that their stories are told. These people are all making art. Anamaria and I were lucky enough to visit some of the art makers in Cartagena de Indias, who are producing fantastic alternative stories for young people against sexual violence, against racial violence. The artwork done by young people all over Colombia in the places I've been against violence and thematizing the hope for peace is incredibly inspirational. But there needs to be, and this is something Wolfgang, you would know what Enrique considers when he's looking at the survival of indigenous and threatened languages. There needs to be a proper national as well as regional set of cultural policies that is not about economía naranja, the orange economy promulgated by DC and its minions to try to make creative industries popular, but is about actually giving voice to those who have plenty to say and are saying it in dance, in theater, in drama, in a myriad of domains, but whose messages do not get out, do not get diffused as they should.
And I think that social media is playing an important role. In the same way that is a mess, it is also playing a role, because it is giving those spaces that Toby is talking about. In the project that I'm working with, Anamaria, we are, the research product is a digital archive. And in this digital archive, we are recording these performances and artistic processes in the Chocó, in the Pacific region, which is one of the most affected regions by the conflict and poverty. Is the poorest region in Colombia, is the main Afro-descendant settlement combined with indigenous, and all the drugs are going away the country through the Pacific. So it's a really contested region. And in this digital platform is giving this kind of voice. But also during the pandemic, it's quite interesting also to note how these Zoom sessions and conferences and events are including these other voices that was unable to do before, because academic conferences or festivals or the places where the voice is given are also open to certain populations. Nowadays, with these digital tools, we are also able to bring people from Africa, from Latin America, Asia, all together to discuss issues. So I think this is something that is really changing and is giving a platform. There is this amazing book, Performing Constellations, that talks about that, how these physical protests bring people together, but also the activism, the digital activism is growing a lot in Latin America and is one of the the big ones. So that's yeah, one space for change.
Yes, and continuing on that, I think that what I find interesting about these artistic practices is that they are not, they didn't work after what's going on. They work in the middle of the everyday life, which is riddled with violence. So these are collectives or groups of people used to work under the direst of conditions, but they are also not waiting for NGOs or the state to give them a voice, because it's proven that these are another NGOs and the state. I'm not saying all NGOs, but many are very problematic in terms of these types of aid that they give to the regions. So they are creating networks to speak. They are creating connections between Latin America, between the global South, that I found very, very interesting. When we were doing fieldwork in the Pacific, when we approached a group, most of them had a YouTube channel, or they have a Facebook account where they post their things. And also, I find very interesting that collectives from the cities, like artistic collectives from the cities, are also reaching out to artistic collectives from the regions to create solidarity networks and to amplify the voices. So hopefully very interesting things will come off of that.
Great.
And I want to add something just to finish. And it's also that we are changing, like society is changing. I was recently in Támesis, it's a place here in Antioquia. And there was a piece of land that this is a guy I met. His father couldn't enjoy because of the paramilitary and the guerrillas invasions of the 80s and 90s. So that land was out of use because of the presence of guerrillas. Nowadays, these young guys took the piece of land to make an reservoir, where they are harvesting again. They are working with local communities to promote the local economies rather than the economies of the city. So they are using the land in a different way from cattle, and in a different way from the ones that previous generations used land in Colombia. So that's another space of action that people are already implementing or acting.
Rui, one last word.
Yeah, one quick comment. I was just making notes of this, and I think Olga, Lucia, you really ended it on a really important note for me, because I'm struggling with these issues, my research, because it's not enough to bring the performative elements together as a form of resistance. The idea is to find a consonance between popular culture and popular economies. People's economies. So it has to be people's voices and people's economies that have to kind of merge together to create a new social order in the face of the disaster that we are facing across the world. So it's what you just noted, Olga, that gives me so much hope, that these are not just finding their voices, they're finding a new livelihood, which is alternate, which is giving them dignity. And it's this coming together. That is where I think we scholars and activists need to come forward and, take these examples across the world and find a new way out. Thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful. Thank you, Georgia, for bringing them together.
Thank you. And thank you, Rui, for ending us on such a great note. Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Anamaria. This was great. If we could meet in person, we'd now give you a glass of wine, but next year.
That's a shame. We'll drink it at home.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here.
Nice to see you. Bye.